In 1933, the Pierce Arrow Motor Car Company was fighting for its life. This was a company that had once built automobiles for 5 American presidents. Woodrow Wilson rode in one. So did William Howard Taft. The company's signature feature, those headlights mounted directly into the fenders, was so distinctive that competitors spent years trying to copy it without getting sued. Pierce Arrow didn't just make cars, they made statements. And for 3 decades, owning one meant you had arrived. But by 1933, the factory in Buffalo, New York, was running at a fraction of its capacity. The showrooms that once welcomed railroad barons and oil tycoons now sat mostly empty. Along the way, we will encounter engineering brilliance that rivaled anything from Europe, a battle against economic forces no amount of horsepower could overcome, and a company that refused to compromise its standards even as those standards were killing it. So let us begin. But first, how did Pierce Arrow become the name that mattered in American luxury? The story starts in 1901, but the company itself was older than that. George N. Pierce had been manufacturing bird cages in Buffalo since 1865. Bird cages. I love that detail. From bird cages, he moved to bicycles in the 1890s, because everyone was moving to bicycles in the 1890s. And from bicycles, the logical next step was automobiles. The first Pierce automobile was called the Motorette. It had a single-cylinder engine producing all of 2 3/4 horsepower. It was, by all accounts, not particularly impressive. But George Pierce wasn't interested in building cheap cars for the masses. From the very beginning, he wanted to build the finest automobiles money could buy, and that meant hiring the right people. In 1901, Pierce brought on an engineer named David Fergusson. Now Fergusson was a perfectionist of the highest order, the kind of engineer who would reject a part not because it didn't work, but because it didn't look right. Under his direction, Pierce automobiles began to develop a reputation for quality that bordered on obsessive. Every component was inspected multiple times. Every assembly was tested and retested. If something wasn't perfect, it didn't leave the factory. By 1904, Pierce was building a car called the Great Arrow. And this thing was winning races, not because it was the fastest, though it wasn't slow, but because it was reliable. In the Glidden Tour reliability trials, Pierce automobiles dominated. They won in 1905, they won in 1906, they won in 1907, 1908, and 1909. 5 consecutive victories. That's not luck. That's engineering. The reason I bring this up is that reliability mattered enormously in those early days. Cars broke down constantly. Roads were terrible. If you bought an automobile in 1905, you were essentially gambling that you'd actually get where you were going. Pierce Arrow, as the company became known in 1909, made that gamble considerably safer. Now here's where the engines come in. Because while everyone remembers Pierce Arrow for its luxury, the real story is under the hood. In 1910, Pierce Arrow introduced a 6-cylinder engine that would set the standard for American luxury cars. This wasn't just any 6. It was a T-head design with dual camshafts, one on each side of the engine, operating the intake and exhaust valves separately. The thing was massive, 825 cubic inches. That's over 13.5 liters. And it produced somewhere around 60 horsepower, which doesn't sound like much until you remember that most cars at the time were making maybe 20. But raw power wasn't the point. The point was refinement. Pierce Arrow engines were built to tolerances that other manufacturers wouldn't achieve for decades. The main bearings were enormous, reducing stress and extending life. The crankshafts were balanced with a precision that eliminated most vibration. When you started a Pierce Arrow, it didn't shake or rattle. It simply hummed. David Fergusson insisted on this. He had a saying that became something of a company motto: "The best cannot be made cheaply." And he meant it. Pierce Arrow used aluminum extensively when other manufacturers were still figuring out how to work with it. They specified materials that cost 3 times what competitors were paying. They rejected parts that any other factory would have shipped without a second thought. The result was an engine that could run for hundreds of thousands of miles without major service. There are documented cases of Pierce Arrow automobiles exceeding 400,000 miles on their original engines. In an era when most cars were worn out by 50,000 miles, this was extraordinary. By the mid-1910s, Pierce Arrow had established itself as the American Rolls-Royce. The company didn't advertise prices. If you had to ask, you couldn't afford it. A typical Pierce Arrow cost between $4,000 and $8,000 at a time, when a Ford Model T sold for under $500. We're talking 15 to 20 times the price of a mass-market automobile, and people paid it gladly. The customer list reads like a who's who of American wealth and power. The Rockefellers owned Pierce Arrows, so did the Vanderbilts, J.P. Morgan, Andrew Carnegie. These weren't people who needed to impress anyone. They bought Pierce Arrows because Pierce Arrows were simply the best. And that's when everything changed. In 1914, World War I began in Europe. Now, you might think this would be bad for a luxury car manufacturer, and eventually it would be. But in the short term, it was actually a boost. Pierce Arrow pivoted to military production, building trucks for the Allied forces. The same engineering excellence that went into their automobiles went into their military vehicles, and when the war ended, the company emerged with its reputation intact and its factories modernized. The 1920s should have been Pierce Arrow's golden age. America was booming. The stock market was climbing. There was more wealth in the country than ever before. And Pierce Arrow responded with some of the most beautiful automobiles ever built. In 1924, they introduced a new inline-six engine. This one was an L-head design, simpler and more compact than the old T-head, but just as refined. It displaced 400 foreign cubic inches and made around 100 horsepower. More importantly, it was quieter and smoother than anything else on the road. But here's the thing. While Pierce Arrow was perfecting its six-cylinder engines, the competition was moving to eights. Cadillac had introduced a V8 back in 1915. Packard followed. Lincoln, which Henry Ford had bought out of bankruptcy in 1922, was building V8s as well. The market was shifting, and Pierce Arrow was slow to respond. It wasn't until 1929 that Pierce Arrow finally introduced an eight-cylinder engine, and when they did, they didn't do it halfway. The new engine was a straight 8, not a V8. Inline engines are inherently smoother than V configurations because all the cylinders fire in a single plane. For a company obsessed with refinement, it was the obvious choice. The Pierce Arrow straight 8 displaced 366 cubic inches and produced 125 horsepower. It featured 9 main bearings, more than almost any other engine on the market, which meant the crankshaft was supported at every possible point. The result was an engine so smooth that you could balance a coin on it while it ran. If you've made it this far, you're probably into this kind of stuff. Quick question. Where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. And hey, subscribe if you haven't. We do this every week. All right, here's what happened next. Because 1929 was both the best year and the worst year for Pierce Arrow. In the spring of 1929, the company introduced something remarkable, a V12 engine. Not just any V12, but a 150-degree V12, which meant the cylinder banks were spread at an unusually wide angle. This configuration allowed for a lower hood line while maintaining perfect primary balance. The engine displaced 398 cubic inches initially, later growing to 462 and produced up to 175 horsepower. Think about that for a moment. In 1929, Pierce Arrow was building a 12-cylinder luxury automobile that could cruise at 80 miles per hour in near silence. The engineering was decades ahead of its time, but the timing couldn't have been worse. On October 29, 1929, the stock market crashed. The Roaring Twenties ended overnight, and the market for $8,000 automobiles evaporated. Now, here's where it gets tragic. Because Pierce Arrow did almost everything right in response to the Depression, and it still wasn't enough. They cut prices. The company that had never advertised prices began advertising them aggressively. A Pierce Arrow that would have cost $8,000 in 1929 could be had for $3,500 by 1932. They were essentially selling at cost just to keep the factory running. They introduced smaller, more affordable models. The new 8-cylinder cars were positioned to compete with Packard and Cadillac, not just with Rolls-Royce. But affordable is relative. Even the cheapest Pierce Arrow still cost more than a Buick or Chrysler. They innovated constantly. In 1933, Pierce Arrow unveiled the Silver Arrow, one of the most advanced automobiles ever built. It was a streamlined, aerodynamic masterpiece, designed with flush door handles, hidden running boards, and a fastback roofline that wouldn't become common for another 20 years. The Silver Arrow was displayed at the Chicago World's Fair, and people came from across the country just to look at it. But looking isn't buying. Pierce Arrow sold fewer than 3 dozen Silver Arrows. At $10,000 each, almost nobody could afford them. The company tried everything. They merged with Studebaker in 1928, hoping the larger company's resources would provide stability. But Studebaker was struggling too. By 1933, Studebaker was in receivership, and Pierce Arrow was set adrift again. A group of Buffalo businessmen bought the company out of the Studebaker wreckage. They were determined to keep the brand alive. They believed, not unreasonably, that the Depression wouldn't last forever, and that when prosperity returned, there would once again be a market for the finest automobiles money could buy. They were half right. The Depression did eventually end. But by then, Pierce Arrow was gone. The problem wasn't the cars, the problem was volume. Pierce Arrow had never built more than 10,000 automobiles in a single year. Even in the best of times, their production was tiny compared to Cadillac or Packard. And during the Depression, it dropped to almost nothing. In 1934, Pierce Arrow built around 1,700 cars. In 1935, around 800. In 1936, fewer than 800. Each car was still magnificent. The engines were still among the finest ever produced. The craftsmanship was still beyond reproach. But you can't run a factory on 800 cars a year. The math simply doesn't work. The straight-8 engines continued to improve. By the mid-1930s, they were producing around 140 horsepower with exceptional smoothness. The V12s were making 175 horsepower and could push a Pierce Arrow to speeds that most drivers would never attempt. Magazine tests consistently praised the car's silence, their stability at speed, their quality of construction. None of it mattered. See, this is the cruel irony of Pierce Arrow's story. They never compromised, they never cheapened their product, they never abandoned their principles, and those principles destroyed them. Other luxury manufacturers survived the Depression by cutting corners. Packard introduced cheaper models that sold in significant numbers. Cadillac benefited from General Motors' massive resources. Lincoln had Ford's backing, but Pierce Arrow had only itself, and itself wasn't enough. By 1937, the end was near. The Buffalo factory was operating sporadically. The workforce that had once numbered in the thousands was down to a few hundred. Orders had slowed to a trickle. The final Pierce Arrow automobiles were built in 1938. The factory closed on May 13th of that year. The remaining inventory was sold off at auction. The tooling was scrapped. The brand name was acquired by a succession of companies that never did anything with it. Just like that, one of America's greatest automobile manufacturers ceased to exist. And what of the engines? The magnificent straight-8s and V12s that had powered the most prestigious automobiles in America? Some of them are still running. Pierce Arrow engines were so well built that many have survived to the present day with their original components intact. Collectors treasure them not just for their rarity, but for their quality. When you open the hood of a surviving Pierce Arrow, you're looking at engineering that was ahead of its time in 1935 and remains impressive today. There's a Pierce Arrow V12 engine at the Buffalo History Museum. It's been sectioned, cut in half to show the internal components, and it's still beautiful. The precision of the machining, the quality of the materials, the thoughtfulness of the design. This was an engine built by people who cared about their work in a way that's difficult to explain. And what of David Fergusson, the engineer who had done so much to establish Pierce Arrow's reputation for quality? He had left the company in 1919, before the troubles began. He died in 1934, just as Pierce Arrow was entering its final decline. Perhaps that was a mercy. He didn't have to watch the company he had helped build fade away. George Pierce had died back in 1910 at the height of the company's success. He never saw the depression. He never saw the struggle. He never saw his name removed from automobile showrooms across America. The company he founded survived him by only 28 years. The Buffalo factory still stands, or at least parts of it do. It's been converted to other uses over the decades. Most people who drive past have no idea what was once built there. The finest automobiles in America, engines that set standards the industry wouldn't match for generations, cars that presidents rode in, all of it, gone. Not because it wasn't good enough, because the times changed and Pierce Arrow couldn't change with them. I think about that sometimes. There's a lesson there, though. I'm not sure what it is. Maybe it's that excellence isn't always enough. Maybe it's that timing matters more than we'd like to admit. Maybe it's that some companies are built for a world that doesn't exist anymore, and when that world ends, they end with it. Pierce Arrow never made a bad car, not one. Even in the final years, when money was tight and the future was grim, they maintained their standards. The last Pierce Arrow that rolled out of Buffalo in 1938 was built to the same exacting specifications as the first great Arrow of 1904. They went out as they had lived, uncompromising. There's something admirable about that, and something sad. The engines remain. A few hundred Pierce Arrows survive in collections around the world. Occasionally one comes up for auction and fetches prices that would have seemed absurd in 1938. The brand that couldn't survive the Depression has become a collector's item, valuable precisely because so few were made. If George Pierce could see what his automobiles sell for today, I wonder what he'd think. Probably that they were always worth the price. He was that kind of man, and that is the story of Pierce Arrow. A company that built some of the finest engines and automobiles America ever produced, and disappeared because excellence alone couldn't save it from history. Subscribe if you want more, and let me know in the comments. Had you heard of Pierce Arrow before this? Take care, and I'll see you in the next one.